October 11th. At 0327 UTC, telescopes across 3 continents caught the same flash. A high-velocity object slammed directly into 3I Atlas, and what happened in the seconds that followed defied every expectation. There was no fragmentation, no expanding debris field, no cascading trail of vaporized material. Instead, the object went silent, and then it began to glow. Within minutes, the collision site stabilized into a perfect luminous ring, emitting multiband frequencies no one could immediately identify. Ground-based infrared arrays recorded a sudden spike in thermal output that didn't decay like a typical impact event. It plateaued, as if the kinetic energy hadn't been released, but absorbed. By dawn, data from observatories in Chile, South Africa and Japan confirmed what was unthinkable just hours earlier. 3I Atlas had endured a high-energy collision without visible structural damage, and its brightness curve suggested energy storage, not dissipation. This wasn't just another anomaly in the sky, this was a maneuver, and what came next would push physics, strategy and belief systems to their breaking point. The first alert didn't come from a government agency. It came from a civilian array in Chile. At 3:27:46 UTC, the optical telescope of a small amateur consortium flagged a sharp rise in luminosity on the leading edge of 3I Atlas. A brilliant flash bloomed for less than a second, sharp and surgical. Then, silence. No fragments, no irregular flare decay, no dispersal cloud drifting outward into the void. Just the object, hanging there as if nothing had touched it. Within 2 minutes, 3 more observatories, in South Africa, Japan and Hawaii, confirmed the same pattern. This wasn't sensor error, it wasn't glare. The impact signature was real, and it was precise. A kinetic collision at hypersonic speed had just occurred in deep space. Under any conventional model, this should have triggered a violent cascade: ejector fields, shockwave diffraction, rotational destabilization. Instead, the post-impact reading showed stability. The object didn't even flinch. The first data burst came from the Atacama Array's high-speed photometry system. The light curve was unlike anything ever recorded. There was an instantaneous peak, then a sudden leveling, a perfectly flat plateau of thermal and radiative output. No exponential decay, no shock dispersal curve. It was as if the impact's energy had been taken in, swallowed whole, and stored somewhere inside the body of 3I Atlas. That alone was enough to set off alarms across every major monitoring network. The Deep Space Early Warning Center in Colorado issued a Level 4 alert. Within minutes, encrypted channels between the European Space Operations Center, NASA's Near-Earth Object Program, and the Japanese Space Agency lit up with burst traffic. At 3:41 UTC, an internal classification memo labelled the event as Category Black, an impact with unknown energetic behaviour and possible strategic implications. Trajectory reconstruction was completed at 03:58 UTC. The impactor's arc was narrow, steep and surgically targeted. It intersected 3I Atlas at less than a 3-degree offset from its rotational axis, a near-perfect strike zone for maximum energy transfer. In other words, the path didn't look random, it looked aimed. The probability of a naturally occurring body hitting that exact vector is lower than 1 in 80 million. Even conservative analysts admitted either this was the most improbable natural impact ever recorded, or someone was steering. Meanwhile, civilian tracking systems struggled to keep up. Amateur astronomers scanning the object through lower resolution equipment were the first to notice something chilling. Instead of debris expanding outward, the light around the impact point intensified. A faint greenish corona began to emerge, symmetrical, pulsing at exact intervals. In raw data, the pulses showed a rhythmic pattern. Not noise, not random bursts, a beat. By the 1-hour mark, internal agency reports documented a second, even stranger anomaly: no trajectory deviation. Under normal conditions, even a small impact would impart measurable recoil. But the vector of 3E Atlas remained unchanged to within thousandths of a degree. The object had not absorbed just the energy, it had somehow neutralized momentum itself. Inside secured data rooms, scientists argued over their screens. Words like perfect absorber, zero recoil, and non-classical response began appearing in technical logs. Some invoked theoretical energy sink models, impossible technologies that exist only in papers about controlled space-time manipulation. Others refused to speculate, labeling the event as inconclusive, but no one could deny the numbers. Public feeds remained quiet. News outlets ran short blurbs. Unusual flash detected near 3I Atlas. Nothing more, but inside defense command structures the language shifted rapidly from observation to strategy. Tracking satellites were retasked. Radio telescope arrays were pointed and locked. Monitoring networks that normally focused on planetary defense began speaking in classified codes. At 4:33 UTC, the final confirmation came in. The object was intact, stable, and glowing brighter than before. Whatever hit it wasn't just gone. Its energy had become part of the system. The world didn't yet know it, but this was the moment the story turned. The impact wasn't a strike, it was a trigger. In the immediate aftermath of the collision, something began happening inside 3I Atlas that defied every established physical model. Instead of dimming, instead of cooling, the impact site stabilized into a perfect luminous corona, bright, unwavering, and eerily symmetrical. It was as if the object had swallowed a detonation the size of a small fusion device and turned it into a stable power source. By 0500 UTC, the infrared signatures were pouring in from ground-based stations. The thermal plateau had locked into a flatline at 1200 Kelvin, hot but abnormally stable. Under natural physics, post-impact energy bleeds into the surrounding vacuum over time. Even icy bodies, when struck, shed heat through sublimation, plume formation, and thermal decay. But here, nothing was escaping. The glow wasn't spreading, it wasn't fading. It was contained. A joint analysis between the European Space Operations Centre and the Infrared Telescope Facility in Hawaii revealed something stranger. The energy curve wasn't just holding steady, it was climbing in small, perfectly timed increments. Like a system actively regulating its intake, it looked engineered, controlled. Within the hour, the first spectral deconvolutions arrived from the Very Large Telescope. What they found shook even seasoned astrophysicists, high-frequency peaks appearing in harmonics that match no known natural emission profile. These weren't chaotic molecular signatures from heated dust or ice. They were structured frequencies stacked in a ladder formation, the kind of thing you'd expect from a resonant energy storage system, not a natural object tumbling through space. Meanwhile, military space surveillance networks began independently corroborating the same thing. The impact energy was not radiating outward, it was missing. According to kinetic estimates, the collision should have released a measurable shock front detectable as far away as Mars' orbit. But all external sensors registered was a soft, diffuse ring of light. 98% of the expected energy was unaccounted for. The first classified briefing took place at 6:12 UTC. Representatives from multiple space agencies, defense departments, and research institutions joined a closed, encrypted line. For the first time, the term perfect absorber was spoken aloud in an official capacity. A system capable of neutralizing and storing impact energy at this scale implied materials and field control orders of magnitude beyond anything Earth possesses. Some tried to force natural explanations. One faction suggested dense exotic ices could have acted as temporary shock absorbers. Another pointed to unknown internal cavities redistributing the energy inward. But these were weak arguments against the math. To absorb that much kinetic energy without external displacement would require a structure behaving like a gravitational well or a non-dissipative energy sink. Neither exists outside of theoretical physics. Then came the second anomaly, electromagnetic echo signatures. Roughly 37 minutes after the collision, sensors began picking up faint emissions across the microwave and near radio bands. At first they were dismissed as background noise, but pattern analysis revealed something more precise. The signal harmonics matched the exact moments when the infrared output climbed. Energy wasn't just stored, it was reformatted. The message circulating internally was short and chilling. This object isn't absorbing energy like a rock, it's processing it. By 0700 UTC, more agencies had joined the feed. The glow was intensifying, the signal was sharpening, and deep space observers began to notice a faint controlled halo forming along the object's trailing axis. Not an expanding dust plume, but a structured uniform ring. A system under intelligent control often betrays itself not by what it emits, but by what it stabilizes. This was stabilization at an impossible scale. As dawn spread across Europe, the story was still invisible to the public. Official feeds released carefully worded neutral statements. An anomalous event has been observed. But the language in private briefings was starkly different. One scientist from the Advanced Propulsion Group put it bluntly: "If this isn't engineered, then we've just watched the universe break its own rules." And yet, even this wasn't the most disturbing part. 2 hours later, the object would do something that stripped away all remaining doubt about randomness, something that looked less like physics and more like intention. At 8:22 UTC, almost exactly 5 hours after the impact, something began to move on the surface of 3E Atlas. Not outward, not an explosion, but inward. The luminous ring that had remained stable since the collision suddenly contracted, its outer edge tightening like the iris of a mechanical lens. High-resolution arrays in Chile and Spain caught the motion frame by frame. It wasn't turbulence, it wasn't diffusion. It was precision geometry emerging out of chaos. Material that should have been vaporized in the collision appeared to be rearranging itself. Spectroscopic readings recorded during this contraction phase detected new signatures, not just altered composition but novel molecular structures. Analysts at the Max Planck Institute described the shift as a rapid, localized atomic-scale reconstruction process, occurring at a speed no natural body could replicate. What made it worse was the organization. Within minutes, the impact zone transformed from an amorphous glow into a hexagonal lattice pattern that spanned almost 12 kilometers across. Each node in that lattice emitted its own electromagnetic frequency, synchronized with the others to within fractions of a millisecond. That level of synchronization implied either a coordinating mechanism or a control system operating beneath the surface. When data from the orbiting reconnaissance platforms arrived, they painted a clearer and more disturbing picture. The lattice wasn't random, it was fractal. Each segment mirrored the structure of the larger pattern, repeating itself with unnerving mathematical precision. This was not debris trying to settle, this was construction. Engineers who studied the transmission curves were stunned. The energy pathways forming through the lattice behaved like waveguides, channeling the stored impact energy along predefined geometric routes. It was as though the collision had supplied the raw energy, and the object was now using it to restructure itself. One classified technical memo described it bluntly: "The object behaves as if the impact was not a threat, but a power input." While scientific teams scrambled to verify the data, something else began to unfold. Narrowband emissions appeared at exact harmonic intervals across the ultraviolet and X-ray spectrum. At first they were faint, almost like background scatter, but their spacing and regularity revealed intention. The signals coincided perfectly with each lattice pulse, suggesting that the structure itself was acting as a transmission array. Inside the Situation Room at the European Space Operations Centre, the tone shifted from astonishment to unease, a solid body behaving like an adaptive machine, an impact acting as fuel, energy being routed, amplified, and then converted into coherent emissions. None of this fit natural models. By mid-morning, researchers began floating comparisons to theoretical programmable matter, a concept that, on Earth, exists only at the lab scale, but this was different. This wasn't microscopic. This was a structure spanning tens of kilometers, reorganizing itself with clockwork precision in the vacuum of space. Data from the Lunar Relay Station confirmed what ground-based telescopes had hinted at. The object's albedo shifted from irregular to nearly mirror-smooth along its leading surface. Its reflectivity increased by 42% in under an hour. Surfaces don't just polish themselves in orbit. Something inside was controlling every layer of this reaction, and then came the trajectory data. At 9:04 UTC, the orbital tracking software registered the first deviation, a fractional course correction so slight it took 3 independent measurements to confirm. No jet signatures, no exhaust, no measurable momentum exchange. Just a subtle, deliberate glide, as if the object were adjusting its position to an invisible cue. Military analysts flagged the maneuver as Class 1 controlled. A natural body can be pushed, nudged, or deflected. But control means something is piloting or responding intelligently. If the lattice formation was the system's way of rebuilding, then the trajectory shift was its way of signaling. It was awake. In a matter of hours, what began as an inexplicable collision had become something far more dangerous to ignore. The object was no longer just absorbing energy, It was using it. At 9:04 UTC, the first deviation appeared in the orbital data stream, subtle, almost imperceptible, buried beneath the noise floor of conventional tracking. It wasn't a jolt. It wasn't a reaction to external force. It was smooth, controlled, intentional. Over the next 43 minutes, 3i Atlas executed a course correction of 0.002 degrees, shifting its vector just enough to alter its projected perihelion by several thousand kilometers. For any natural body, that kind of maneuver without a visible energy source would be unthinkable. But for 3i Atlas, it happened in complete silence. The usual telltales of propulsion weren't there. No plasma jets, no vapor trails, no electromagnetic spikes from ionization. Infrared sensors scanned its leading surface for thermal blooms. Nothing. The object moved as if space itself had tilted beneath it. Analysts from the European Space Operations Center and the North American Space Defense Network compared notes and came to the same grim conclusion. Whatever was moving, this thing wasn't chemical, nuclear or conventional in any known sense. At 9:57 UTC, the lattice structure formed after the impact began to contract further, becoming denser along the trailing axis. That was the key. As the geometry changed, the trajectory changed with it. The maneuver wasn't produced by an engine, the object itself was the engine. High-frequency interferometric readings picked up a microscale oscillation running through the entire structure, a rhythmic pulsing across multiple spectral bands. That pulse matched the exact timing of the vector shift. Dr. Elizabeth Chan, a propulsion physicist embedded in the ESA Rapid Response Team, described it best. It's not pushing against space, it's bending something we don't understand. The closest analogy available, and even that was a stretch, was the concept of momentum cancellation. If an object can redistribute or negate internal impulse vectors, it can alter trajectory without emitting exhaust. On Earth, this remains purely theoretical, relegated to deep papers about reactionless drives and space-time geometries. Yet here it was, happening in real time, in front of every telescope on the planet. As tracking networks locked onto the object, the maneuver profile became clearer. It wasn't a random drift. It was a coordinated reorientation, aligning 3i Atlas along a precise new vector that intersected with a region of space farther along its inbound path. That destination wasn't empty. It corresponded almost perfectly with the location of a secondary inbound object, first catalogued 3 weeks earlier, an object previously dismissed as a fragment or background debris. Suddenly, it didn't look like debris anymore. Inside the classified coordination call at 10:15 UTC, military analysts from 5 nations agreed on a chilling probability curve. The maneuver was not only controlled, it was strategic. The trajectory adjustment positioned 3i Atlas to maximize interaction with that secondary body on a date that aligned with orbital dynamics almost too cleanly to be coincidence. If the collision earlier that morning was a fuel input, then this maneuver was a setup. Meanwhile, electromagnetic surveillance stations began logging something else, a new kind of emission. Faint, extremely narrow band transmissions pulsed in perfect alignment with the trajectory correction sequence. They weren't broad cosmic bursts or plasma noise. They were surgical, timed, structured. It looked less like a natural reaction and more like a navigation protocol. Publicly, agencies downplayed the shift as anomalous behavior requiring further study. Privately, they were already running military intercept simulations. If this was a craft, not a comet, then it was actively responding to an event and preparing for another. What unsettled analysts the most wasn't the maneuver itself, but the precision. There was no wasted motion, no error margin. It moved as if following a pre-existing plan. And no one on Earth knew what the next step in that plan was. At 10:41 UTC, just over an hour after the trajectory shift began, the emissions changed. What had started as faint, narrow band pulses expanded into a structured signal spanning multiple frequency bands simultaneously, from deep VLF to the upper microwave spectrum. And this time, it wasn't noise, it was coordinated. Every pulse lined up with the object's oscillation frequency, locked with the precision of an atomic clock. Within 20 minutes, receivers on 3 continents picked up identical transmissions. Observatories in Spain, Australia, and Alaska all reported synchronized bursts, repeating every 63 seconds down to the millisecond. They weren't coming from a single point, but from multiple regions across the surface of 3i Atlas. The lattice zones, the very same geometric patterns formed after the impact, had become active transmitters. Early attempts to decode the emissions revealed a breathtaking level of complexity. At first glance, the signal looked like broadband scatter folded across multiple harmonic layers, but deeper analysis revealed modulation bands nested inside each other, like encrypted messages within encrypted messages. The lowest frequencies carried a simple pulse train, the mid-range carried a second layer of phase-modulated sequences, and the highest frequencies carried packets structured like compressed data streams. This wasn't just a reaction, it was communication. The global science net fractured overnight into two camps. The first argued for a natural emergent resonance effect, some unknown material interaction causing electromagnetic harmonics. The second saw something else entirely, a coordinated signalling network. Patterns this structured don't arise by chance. They are built, synchronized, and controlled. Military agencies moved faster than the scientific community. At 11:02 UTC, US and European surveillance networks began active triangulation sweeps. The signals weren't broadcast isotropically, they were directional. Analysts quickly identified the primary lobe of the transmission, aimed directly at Earth. Within minutes, communications satellites began picking up weak echoes in higher orbital bands. The emissions were refracting through Earth's ionosphere, bending in ways that suggested deliberate target alignment. Civilian radio astronomy teams who stumbled onto the pulse stream thought they were detecting interference. Within hours, their recordings were quietly seized. The key moment came at 11:37 UTC. A tiny phase drift appeared in the signal, a single, almost imperceptible delay between the pulses of different surface nodes. That drift wasn't random, it encoded geometric information. A technical report from the Deep Space Communications Network described it succinctly. This is not noise, this is handshake protocol. In other words, 3i Atlas wasn't just broadcasting, it was listening. The network across its surface nodes was behaving like an array trying to lock onto a response source. Analysts compared the handshake structure to known terrestrial protocols, satellite initialization sequences, secure link negotiations, quantum keying systems. It wasn't a match to any of them. But the architecture was familiar in a way that made specialists uneasy. Layered authentication, increasing in complexity with every cycle. Meanwhile, public news outlets were still reporting a minor orbital anomaly. The world didn't know that governments were already building signal decoding task forces. Within classified channels, something extraordinary was already being discussed. If this was handshake protocol, then it meant the object expected, or wanted, a reply. But perhaps the most unsettling part wasn't what it transmitted, it was how it coordinated. Every lattice pulse, every band shift, every packet of structured noise was synchronized with the object's physical oscillation. The network wasn't separate from its structure. The structure was the network. At 12:04 UTC, an internal summary circulated among multiple agencies. 6 words were highlighted in red. This is not a signal. It's a system. What the object had just revealed went beyond its energy absorption or its silent maneuver. It was intelligent, organized, communicating in a language built not of words but of geometry, timing and precision, and Earth was now locked in its crosshairs. At 12:29 UTC, as analysts across multiple networks were still struggling to make sense of the handshake signal, the object's power output spiked. Not gradually, not incrementally, but in a single, precise step. Infrared and microwave telemetry showed a sudden sharp jump in thermal emissions across the surface of 3i Atlas. It wasn't an explosion, nor the chaotic flare of heated material. It was stable, controlled, purposeful. Thermal imaging from the Lunar Relay Station revealed a new pattern. The heat wasn't evenly distributed, it was channeled. Lines of high-intensity output traced along the existing lattice geometry, like currents moving through a circuit board on a scale measured in kilometers. Each node flared in sequence, one after another, in a pattern that repeated with perfect periodicity. At first, analysts thought this was some kind of slow radiation of stored impact energy. But then the power curve kept climbing. It didn't taper off like residual heat. It plateaued again at a new, higher baseline. Calculations run at the Advanced Propulsion Lab in Bremen estimated that the power output was equivalent to a continuous fusion reaction the size of a large industrial plant, and rising. Then came the most disturbing discovery. The total energy radiated did not match the amount stored from the impact. It was more, significantly more. The figures coming from 3 independent stations, Atacama, Lunar Relay and Okinawa, all converged on the same ratio. For every joule that had gone into the system during the collision, more than 3 joules were now coming out. A report from the Deep Space Energy Analysis Task Force put it bluntly: this violates conservation of energy. Full stop. Of course, the equation isn't that simple. On Earth, physicists have toyed with the idea of vacuum energy, the latent energy of empty space. It's theoretical, elusive, and, until now, untapped. But the behaviour of 3I Atlas fit uncomfortably well with predictions found only in classified propulsion studies and fringe cosmology. The object wasn't just storing energy, it was pulling it from somewhere else. At 12:54 UTC, sensors picked up secondary emissions across the radio spectrum. Faint at first, then rapidly strengthening. The emissions weren't directed at Earth this time. They spread outward in a controlled spherical wavefront, like a beacon. It was as though the object had powered up a new layer of its system. The signal harmonic showed substructures that mirrored the lattice pattern on its surface, every pulse an exact map of its internal power grid. This is when the geopolitical temperature shifted. Governments had been watching. Now they were reacting. Within minutes, encrypted lines between Washington, Moscow, Brussels and Beijing were activated. Energy readings of this magnitude, stable, clean, continuous, implied a technology that could power entire cities or destabilize them. Strategic analysts weren't just thinking about astronomy anymore. They were thinking about power projection, control, leverage. Back in the scientific channels, the data got stranger. Magnetometer arrays across the globe began registering faint perturbations in Earth's magnetic field, subtle but synchronized with the object's power oscillation. 3I Atlas wasn't anywhere near close enough to cause measurable geomagnetic disturbance through ordinary interaction. Yet here it was, creating ripples across a planetary field. Something in its emissions resonated at frequencies that bled into magnetospheric harmonics. Dr. Hassan Mubarak, a field theorist on the Late Night Review call, summed it up in one line that chilled the entire room. We're not looking at propulsion, we're looking at infrastructure. As the object pulsed, the surrounding space behaved differently. Plasma sensors on satellites began reporting faint density fluctuations in the solar wind, as if a pocket of localized space was being stabilized, shaped around the object. Whatever it was doing, it was building something far more sophisticated than a response to an impact. And deep within the encrypted signal stack, analysts began noticing subtle repeating patterns, embedded checksum sequences, recursive loops, and header-like markers. Patterns that looked less like a natural emission and more like protocol. The impact had powered it. The maneuver had positioned it. The network had connected it. And now it was fully awake. At 13:08 UTC, the first surface changes began. What had been a static hexagonal lattice since the impact started to flow. Not break apart, but flow. High-resolution optical data showed sharp, linear edges beginning to soften, shifting and reconnecting in perfectly coordinated sequences. Under normal conditions, structural reconfiguration in space would mean fracture or thermal degradation. Here, it looked like a living machine rewriting its own architecture. Spectroscopy revealed something few were prepared to believe. The chemical composition of the impact zone was no longer consistent with known carbonaceous or metallic structures. Elemental ratios were fluctuating dynamically. One moment it resembled nickel-iron composite. Seconds later, traces of silicate bonded with complex carbon chains. Then it shifted again, back to a crystalline state that mirrored neither natural nor industrial alloys on record. At 13:26 UTC, interferometric mapping confirmed the impossible. The object's surface was behaving like programmable matter capable of altering its physical and electromagnetic properties in real time based on incoming signals. On Earth, programmable matter exists only at micro or nanoscales in advanced labs. Here, it was happening across an area larger than most cities. The geometric patterns reorganizing along the surface weren't random. They aligned with the energy distribution nodes identified during the power spike. Each lattice cell, some more than a kilometre wide, folded into new shapes that looked like modular panels locking into an updated configuration. They weren't melting or fusing, they were compiling. Military analysts watching the live spectral feed from the lunar relay station saw something else. Every reconfiguration step was accompanied by an electromagnetic burst across multiple bands. It was as though the structure wasn't just reacting, it was receiving instructions. The handshake signal detected earlier was now clearly functioning as an operational protocol, driving a real-time rewrite of the object's architecture. A private memo from the ESA propulsion desk leaked hours later contained one chilling line: "This isn't a comet adapting. This is a machine reprogramming itself." At 1342 UTC, the surface reflectivity changed again, this time dramatically. Sections of the object turned pitch black, absorbing nearly all incoming light, while other zones shifted to a mirrored finish, reflecting starlight with surgical sharpness. This wasn't random material behaviour, these were optical states, toggled intentionally. Engineers who had worked on Earth-based adaptive coatings recognised the pattern instantly, but never at this scale. Inside the classified review call, theoretical physicists from 3 agencies began discussing the unthinkable. What if the material wasn't simply programmable, but networked? If each lattice cell could act as both sensor and actuator, the entire object could operate as a distributed processing system, a physical computer running its own structural code. The implications were staggering. A machine that could alter its own geometry and energy profile in real time could also rewrite its defense, its propulsion, and even its purpose without external intervention. It wouldn't need thrusters, it wouldn't need antennas. The structure itself would be everything: engine, sensor, transmitter, shield. Then came the second layer of anomaly. At 1403 UTC, analysts began picking up faint coherent field distortions around the object. Magnetometers, interferometers, and plasma sensors across multiple orbits recorded identical data. The surrounding vacuum wasn't behaving like a vacuum anymore. It was structured. The fluctuations synchronized with the lattice transformations, indicating the material was manipulating local spacetime or electromagnetic fields to an extent humanity had never observed. This wasn't a passive object adapting to an event. This was a system actively modifying its environment. The collision had not damaged it. It had upgraded it. Somewhere deep in the handshake signal, encryption specialists noticed a new layer appearing. A recursive loop of packet headers repeating at fixed intervals. Every time the structure changed, the signal changed with it. It wasn't a broadcast anymore, it was an evolving conversation. The unspoken realization hung heavy in the classified channels. If it can rewrite itself, it can also rewrite its function. And whatever that function was, it was building towards something scheduled, something planned. At 1426 UTC, orbital models locked onto something that changed the entire tone of the analysis. The trajectory of 3I Atlas was no longer following its original predictive arc. Its new path intersected directly with the inbound course of a second object, smaller, colder, previously catalogued as unremarkable debris, until now. This secondary body, designated Track 941, had been drifting along a quiet arc since late September. No one paid much attention to it. It emitted no unusual signatures, reflected little sunlight, and appeared inert. But the maneuver executed by 3 Atlas earlier that day aligned perfectly with its approach vector, with a calculated intercept time of 11 days, 3 hours and 16 minutes, not a day more, not a day less. The precision was surgical. If the course shift had been off by even a fraction of a degree, the two bodies would have passed by each other with hundreds of kilometers of separation, but the updated model showed their trajectories converging with less than 200 meters of margin. That wasn't orbital coincidence, that was a rendezvous. Inside the control room at the European Space Operations Centre, the tension shifted from scientific curiosity to strategic awareness. This was no longer a static anomaly in deep space, it was a scheduled event. At 1448 UTC, new data began to emerge from the lunar relay station. The structured emissions detected earlier, the so-called handshake signal, began phasing into a new state. Transmission cycles shortened from 63 seconds to 21 seconds, and additional harmonic layers were added. Encryption specialists monitoring the signal described it as handshake escalation. This is what secure systems do when they approach the moment of authentication, when they prepare to connect. But what made this escalation unnerving wasn't just the timing, it was the vector of the signal itself. analysis showed that it was no longer targeting only Earth. A second, tightly focused beam was now pointed directly at track 941. 1457 UTC, the first return signal was detected. Faint, delayed by 4.8 seconds, the exact round-trip time for the distance between the two objects. Track 941 had responded. For the first time since the morning's collision, every analyst in every control room, civilian, military and scientific, fell silent. Two objects, both interstellar in origin, were now talking to each other. What happened next was unlike anything recorded in deep space telemetry. The energy baseline of 3I Atlas began to climb again, but this time it didn't plateau. It ramped upward in smooth, controlled increments, as if following a power schedule. The surface lattice geometry responded to the handshake escalation by reconfiguring into a more compact, streamlined structure. Individual nodes began to fold inward, creating long, narrow channels aligned with the object's trajectory toward track 941. It looked less like a defensive posture and more like a docking configuration. In parallel, track 941's albedo changed for the first time since it was catalogued. Its surface brightened by nearly 40% over a 20-minute period, a sharp, structured glow forming along its equator. Whatever had been dormant inside it wasn't dormant anymore. By 1519 UTC, mission analysts began using a term no one had dared to use until now: event window. The handshake wasn't random signaling. The power anomalies weren't arbitrary. The silent maneuver hours earlier wasn't reactionary. Everything, the impact, the reconfiguration, the communications, had been part of a timeline. And now, the next step in that timeline had a date. Publicly, agencies still described both objects as under study. But internally, simulations were already running. What happens when two interstellar machines meet in controlled proximity within the solar system? What happens when the handshake completes? One analyst in Washington summed it up in a single quiet line over a secure channel. It wasn't waiting for us. It was waiting for this. The event wasn't unfolding by chance. It was unfolding by design. By 1543 UTC, the question that had been lingering in the background since the first impact finally moved to the center of every briefing. Was 3I Atlas acting on its own, or was something, or someone, directing it? Inside a secure conference chamber beneath the European Space Operations Center, a dozen monitors displayed synchronized telemetry feeds, energy curves, orbital projections, signal harmonics, and spectral maps. For the first time, intelligence analysts, military strategists, astrophysicists, and cryptography specialists were seated at the same table. What had begun as a scientific anomaly was now a geostrategic flashpoint. The data was unambiguous. 3I Atlas had absorbed the kinetic impact with near-perfect efficiency, reconfigured its structure into a programmable matter lattice, executed a precise silent maneuver, established a handshake protocol, and was now on an intercept course with another object while continuously escalating its energy output. None of these steps could be explained by passive natural mechanics. Something inside the object was making decisions. But what kind of intelligence was the debate? The first faction, made up mostly of astrophysicists and a few cautious strategists, pushed the emergent intelligence hypothesis. They argued that this could be a form of self-organizing alien probe, an autonomous system designed to react to environmental stimuli in a predetermined sequence. According to them, what Earth was witnessing wasn't conscious decision-making, but an activation protocol, a chain of triggered responses that began the moment the impact occurred. The second faction disagreed. These were cryptanalysts, signal intelligence officers, and propulsion experts. They saw something far sharper in the data. The handshake signal wasn't just structured, it was adaptive. Over the past 2 hours, it had shifted its encryption layers multiple times, mirroring the kind of escalation patterns found in adaptive military communications or deep network AI systems. That implied situational awareness. One report from the Advanced Signal Analysis Group was particularly unsettling. The signal adjusts not only to distance and frequency drift, but to our own monitoring attempts. It is responding to being observed by 1610 UTC. A third faction emerged, the smallest but the loudest in the room. They proposed that 3 Atlas was part of a networked intelligence far larger than what humanity could detect. The logic was simple. No system this advanced builds itself in isolation. The handshake may not be a conversation between two objects, It may be a link between nodes in a larger structure. What Earth was seeing could be just one tiny part of a machine spread across interstellar distances. This suggestion fractured the room. If true, then Track 941 was not a coincidence. It was a partner, a relay, a component of something with intent. And that would mean the event unfolding in the inner solar system wasn't random. It was a mission. Meanwhile, public statements from agencies remained deliberately vague. Press releases spoke of unusual resonances and atypical orbital adjustments. But behind the curtain, emergency calls connected world leaders. Multiple militaries quietly raised their alert levels without announcing it. At 1632 UTC, something happened that tilted the debate. The handshake protocol spiked to its fifth encryption layer, and in that moment, 3I Atlas emitted a narrow band burst aimed directly at Earth. Unlike the previous signals, this one was short and contained. Its frequency harmonics matched terrestrial communication windows almost exactly. The packet was intercepted by 3 independent listening arrays and decrypted partially within minutes. Inside the burst were 3 repeating numerical sequences, pi, e, and phi, mathematical constants recognized universally. No natural system emits mathematical constants in structured order. The room fell silent. Emergent intelligence could be argued away. Networked behavior could be speculated about. But a deliberate transmission of universal constants was something else entirely. "We just received a message," whispered one of the cryptographers. "It's not asking, it's announcing." By 1700 hours UTC, the intelligence debate was over. Officially, nothing had been confirmed, but off the record, everyone in that room knew the threshold had been crossed. This wasn't an anomaly, it wasn't a coincidence, it was contact. At 1721 UTC, the transmission containing pi, e, and phi reached the classified communication desks of 5 governments within minutes. By 1735 UTC, the world's largest defense and space agencies were no longer observing. They were mobilizing. This was the moment the event shifted from a scientific emergency to a planetary one. The first major response came from the United States. A top-tier National Security Council alert was issued under a classification normally reserved for nuclear incidents and inbound impact threats. Within minutes, the Strategic Command Network activated satellite repositioning protocols. High-resolution imaging platforms, which usually monitored Earth's surface, were retasked to deep space. By 1742 UTC, similar movements were reported out of Russia and China. European and Japanese early warning arrays went fully operational. All civilian tracking telescopes were quietly fed altered telemetry, a coordinated information management strategy designed to delay public understanding of what was really happening. Official statements used sanitized language, an increase in monitoring activity due to anomalous orbital behavior. Behind the scenes, everything escalated. The encrypted signal containing universal mathematical constants was treated as a contact event, whether or not anyone said the word publicly. This wasn't a vague radio burst from a distant star. It was a structured transmission from a nearby, physically observable object that had already demonstrated maneuverability, energy control, and self-restructuring behavior. Inside a secured NATO command room in Brussels, a dark map of the solar system glowed softly on the wall. One red marker pulsed where 3I Atlas moved along its intercept trajectory. Another marker flashed for track 941. A third marker, the most unsettling of all, hovered over Earth itself. Because the second transmission lobe wasn't just aimed into the void, it was aimed at us. At 1756 UTC, international space agencies signed a rapid coordination memorandum that effectively suspended the usual rivalries. For the first time in modern history, all major deep space tracking resources were shared through a single encrypted relay. Data from the US, ESA, Roscosmos, JAXA, ISRO, and CNSA was merged into one continuous real-time feed. The public would never see this version, but those who did saw something unprecedented, a machine in the solar system behaving like a strategic actor. The military response unfolded in parallel. The US Strategic Command shifted multiple reconnaissance platforms to standby. Russia quietly repositioned orbital assets. China elevated its aerospace defense alert level for the first time in 7 years. The Indo-Pacific command regions began reinforcing satellite uplinks, and over the South Pacific, 2 experimental tracking stations went dark, classified assets redirected toward the object. But perhaps the most revealing move didn't come from militaries. It came from corporations. Private aerospace giants, commercial launch operators, and defense contractors received closed-door briefings before the public did. Within hours, they were rerouting launch manifests, locking down research, and pulling senior engineers into midnight meetings. The implication was clear. This wasn't just a national security issue. It was a technological one. Meanwhile, religious and philosophical organizations were already reacting to early leaks. Even though governments had kept the details classified, the synchronized telescope blackout and sudden burst of encrypted signals didn't go unnoticed. Amateur astronomers, especially those in South America and Eastern Europe, had been recording raw signal streams since morning. Within hours, those recordings began circulating in encrypted channels. The first rumors spread before midnight. They're here. By 1823 UTC, the coordinated response reached its final layer. An emergency joint signal task force, composed of military cryptographers, civilian mathematicians, and astrophysicists, was activated. Their mission was clear: decode the structured handshake, identify intent, determine threat potential. No official statement was issued, but everyone in that room understood what the stakes were. The object wasn't some passive remnant drifting toward the sun. It was aware, powered, and moving with precision toward an orchestrated event. As one anonymous official later described it in a classified memo, "It's not that we don't understand it, it's that it clearly understands us." And while the world outside remained unaware of how deep the crisis had already gone, inside command centers across continents, the countdown toward the intercept window had already begun. Chapter 11. Signal Race. By 1847. UTC, what had begun as a structured handshake between 3i Atlas and Track 941, turned into a global decoding war. The signal wasn't a single broadcast anymore. It was evolving, splitting into multiple bands with independent modulations, like a system opening different encrypted channels simultaneously. On every listening station across the planet, the clock began to matter. Each new pulse introduced changes, and each change made the puzzle harder to solve. The first specialized teams went active almost immediately. At 1852 UTC, a secure line connected the Deep Space Communications Network in California, the European Space Operations Center, and the Joint Intelligence Task Force in Tokyo. Their shared objective was simple but brutal in scope: crack the evolving signal in real time before the intercept window closed. The challenge wasn't just encryption, it was architecture. The signal contained self-modifying layers, meaning its structure changed while it was being analyzed. Cryptographers described it as a moving lock with a shifting key, something that seemed to respond to attempts at decryption. Every brute force attack caused new harmonic shifts, as though the system on the other end was aware of the probing. At 1906 UTC, the US high-frequency listening array detected a new phenomenon. Buried beneath the handshake harmonics was a secondary layer, faint, low frequency, repeating at a slow rhythm of exactly 0.618 Hz. The number wasn't random. 0.618 is the inverse of the golden ratio. The same constant that appeared earlier in the PFI broadcast. The signal wasn't just communicating, it was teaching. Encryption specialists began arguing over its purpose. One faction believed it was an initialization sequence, a way to verify mutual recognition of universal constants before higher-level communication. Another feared something far more dangerous, a challenge-response protocol designed to confirm the presence of another intelligence capable of understanding. At 1918 UTC, Track 941 transmitted back. The delay was shorter this time, 3.2 seconds. This wasn't random cosmic noise bouncing through the void. This was synchronization. Whatever lived inside these objects was accelerating their exchange, closing the gap with frightening precision. Meanwhile, governments were no longer the only players. Despite attempts to control information, parts of the raw signal leaked into private channels used by independent observatories. Within an hour, multiple anonymous cryptography collectives, some with backgrounds in quantum computing and AI research, were working on the handshake independently. The race had spilled into the civilian world. Inside the classified NATO command room, an operational timer was started, T255 hours to projected intercept. If the handshake was truly escalating toward a single event, every hour lost now would mean less understanding when that event arrived. At 1941 UTC, a breakthrough, or something like it. A French cryptographer working with ESA's Deep Signal Lab noticed a repeating signature embedded in the modulation structure. Every 17 cycles, a block of data appeared nearly identical, except for 3 shifting variables. Those variables mapped cleanly onto orbital coordinates. The signal wasn't random or poetic. It contained navigational data, continuously refined and transmitted to both Earth and Track 941. This changed everything. If the handshake carried active navigation instructions, it meant Earth itself was part of the communication architecture. The object wasn't just aware of us, it was including us. A classified summary reached the desks of multiple governments by 2000 hours UTC. 3 lines, written without ambiguity. Handshake is active. Protocol is dynamic. We are inside the loop. The signal race had begun in earnest. The question was no longer whether 3i Atlas was intelligent, but whether humanity could keep up with its pace before the moment of rendezvous arrived. And outside the classified halls, ordinary people with backyard telescopes were already noticing the truth. The object was getting brighter. By 2027 UTC, the first cracks in the global information blackout began to spread. Amateur astronomers from Argentina to Eastern Europe started posting coordinated screenshots of leaf sky captures, showing 3i Atlas increasing in luminosity in perfect intervals. They didn't have access to classified data, but they had eyes, and the object was now bright enough to be seen through mid-range telescopes, glowing with an intensity that rose and fell like the steady rhythm of a beating heart. For weeks the public had only heard scattered rumours, an anomalous visitor, strange observatory activity, a few unexplained orbital adjustments, but that changed the moment the glow became visible to civilian optics. Within an hour, thousands of independent observations began flooding forums, live feeds, and amateur tracking sites. And this time, no amount of official language could drown it out. The first viral post came from a Polish astronomy forum at 2043 UTC, a sequence of images showing a clearly structured light halo forming around the object, with the caption, "It's not a comet." Within minutes, the post was mirrored across platforms in multiple languages. A live stream from a private observatory in Chile pulled in over 2 million viewers before midnight. By 2100 UTC, the signal itself leaked. A small research team in India, using a university-based deep space receiver, published a stripped-down version of the handshake harmonics on an open-access server. Within hours, it had been downloaded hundreds of thousands of times. What governments had spent the day classifying now belonged to the public, to coders, hackers, mathematicians, and conspiracy theorists scattered across the globe. Suddenly, the signal race was no longer just between states. It was between the world itself and the machine in the sky. Media outlets were slower to move, but not for long. At 2118 UTC, a major international news network aired blurred footage of the glowing object with a cautious headline, "Unusual astronomical event under observation." By 2130, 3 other networks followed suit. Public attention shifted overnight from fragmented rumours to focused panic. Governments responded the way they always do, with carefully crafted statements. They described an anomalous celestial phenomenon, emphasized that there is no immediate threat, and repeated that all major space agencies are coordinating closely. But the words were sterile, and the images spreading online were anything but. On encrypted channels, leaked fragments of signal analysis began circulating. The mention of pi, e, and phi, universal constants, reached social media by 2204 UTC. In minutes, hashtags exploded, theories multiplied. Some called it contact, others said weapon, others said it was a trick. But whatever the interpretation, one fact was undeniable. This wasn't just being observed anymore, it was being felt. Religious organizations issued midnight statements. Political figures across continents made vague, contradictory remarks. Stock markets trembled as investors quietly moved capital into defense contractors and satellite companies. Churches filled in parts of Eastern Europe. Mosques in the Middle East stayed open through the night. Broadcasts shifted from entertainment to live coverage of a ski no longer entirely human. But the most unsettling development came from the signal itself. At 22:36 UTC, multiple civilian receivers across the world picked up a duplicate transmission, identical in structure to the classified handshake, but now strong enough to be detected on consumer-grade equipment. The object wasn't just communicating with Track 941 anymore. It had deliberately increased its signal strength to reach the entire planet. The reaction was immediate. Hacker collectives began pooling resources. Amateur cryptographers from dozens of countries formed impromptu decryption networks. In hours, what had been a controlled, classified operation turned into a chaotic, planet-wide decoding effort. Governments could no longer contain it. They could only watch the narrative fracture in real time. For the first time in history, a senior analyst wrote in a private memo that night, humanity isn't reacting as nations, it's reacting as a species. The message in the sky had stepped out of the shadows, and it had found 8 billion listeners. By 23:11 UTC, as the signal's civilian reach exploded, governments made a calculated decision: not to speak, not yet. After an emergency call between Washington, Brussels, Beijing, Moscow and Tokyo, the 5 largest spacefaring powers agreed to adopt what the internal brief called Controlled Silence Protocol. In plain terms, they would deliberately undercommunicate the reality of the event. Not because they didn't understand it, but because they feared what would happen if they did. For the past 20 hours, the event had belonged to specialists, physicists, cryptographers, intelligence officers. But now, with the signal reaching living rooms across the world, control of the narrative had fractured. Rumours, speculation, and amateur translations were spreading faster than any official statement could contain. And any message released now, no matter how cautious, would be interpreted as confirmation of something bigger. Inside the Situation Room of the US National Security Council, a single image was displayed on a wall-sized monitor, a projection of the handshake signal's evolving structure. It now contained 7 encryption layers, each adapting at a faster rate than the one before. The latest layer was pulsing in near-perfect rhythm with Earth's own Schumann resonance frequencies. 3. I-Atlas wasn't just broadcasting into space anymore. It was synchronizing with the planet itself. At 23:27 UTC, a classified report titled Public Trajectory Model, Phase 3 outlined 3 projections. Early disclosure, a joint global statement acknowledging first contact. Partial disclosure, a vague cosmic anomaly narrative to buy time. Silence, total strategic non-engagement. The final decision was made in less than 10 minutes. Option 3. Silence. Strategic silence wasn't passive, it was methodical. Within an hour, broadcast satellites began inserting latency into live astronomical feeds, subtly desynchronizing observations. High-ranking officials gave rehearsed, deliberately uninformative interviews. Intelligence agencies redirected resources away from explaining the event to controlling how people perceived it. But as silence deepened, civilian analysis grew louder. A coordinated group of cryptographers from Germany, India and Brazil made a breakthrough at 23:48 UTC. They identified a repeating sequence hidden inside the 7th encryption layer, a 1.618 second pulse sequence matching Fibonacci intervals. The realization spread through underground channels like wildfire. It wasn't just a signal, it was structured information designed to be understood. Online forums turned feverish. Some believed it was an invitation, others saw it as a threat, others called it proof of an intelligence far beyond Earth. Governments watched these narratives spiral in real time and decided to say nothing. At 0012 UTC, a line appeared in a classified NATO communication log. "We've lost the narrative. Silence is the only control we have left." Meanwhile, inside scientific circles, tension was reaching a breaking point. A growing number of researchers argued that withholding information could backfire catastrophically if the event escalated. Some threatened leaks. Others quietly disappeared from public communication channels altogether. But perhaps the most disturbing development of the night came at 0027 UTC. As the world argued in the dark, the handshake protocol shifted again. For the first time, the frequency alignment between 3 I-Atlas and Track 941 locked into a stable carrier wave. It wasn't fluctuating anymore. It wasn't searching. It had found its match. On every major classified monitor in the world, one message was circulated in stark clear text: handshake complete. Sequence stabilized. This wasn't just a signal anymore, it was an established connection, and the silence hanging over the planet wasn't just strategic, it was the sound of governments realizing they were no longer the first to speak. At 0104 UTC, just 37 minutes after the handshake between 3I Atlas and Track 941 stabilized, deep space tracking arrays registered the first definitive acceleration event. Track 941, the smaller, previously inert body Biguaston, began to move. It wasn't drifting, it wasn't being pulled, it was accelerating along the intercept trajectory with deliberate precision. For the first time, both objects were now moving in perfect synchronization. The world didn't know it yet, but this was the moment when the countdown to the second collision, or what some analysts were already calling the convergence, officially began. Unlike the first impact, this event wasn't a surprise, it was planned. Orbital simulations showed their courses intersecting with almost unnerving mathematical precision. Not an accidental grazing or glancing pass, but a controlled rendezvous, down to a projected contact radius of less than 50 meters. This was spacecraft-grade navigation. By 1:21 UTC, analysts at the Deep Space Command Center observed something they had never seen before in open space. As Track 941 accelerated, its surface began to emit its own structured lattice signature, eerily similar to the one formed on 3I Atlas after the initial impact earlier in the day. This suggested something extraordinary. Track 941 wasn't just approaching, it was activating. The object, once cold and dark, now glowed with the same sharp green-white intensity as 3I Atlas. Observatories noted synchronized harmonic pulses running between both bodies, aligned to the millisecond. Their internal systems, whatever they were now operating as a single network. At 1:44 UTC, for the first time since the beginning of the event, gravitational monitoring satellites detected faint fluctuations between the two bodies. Though subtle, the fluctuations hinted at a localized distortion field, as if both structures were shaping the space around them to guide the final approach. Conventional orbital mechanics couldn't explain their acceleration curves. This wasn't gravity, it was intentional steering. Inside the secure command rooms in Brussels, Moscow and Washington, the language changed. The object was no longer described as an anomaly. It was now officially referred to as an engineered system, and the rendezvous point wasn't just close, it was timed with the precision of a machine executing a long-planned operation. At 2:03 UTC, the joint emissions from the two objects underwent a radical change. Instead of separate signals bouncing back and forth, the streams fused into a single coherent beam directed into deep space, away from Earth. The handshake protocol was complete, the connection had stabilized, and now the system was broadcasting outward. Speculation inside the joint intelligence feed became frantic. Some analysts believed this was an activation broadcast, a status signal, a call to something else. Others suggested it was a stabilization procedure before an unknown energy exchange, but the math left little room for doubt. Power output was climbing rapidly, already exceeding the levels recorded after the first impact. The space between the two objects began to flicker, not visibly but in the readings. Microwave emissions, plasma density and magnetic field intensities all spiked at once. By 2:31 UTC, the projected time to contact was less than 4 hours. Militaries raised their readiness levels. Emergency communications quietly linked heads of state. No official announcements were made, but multiple governments discreetly activated continuity protocols designed for non-kinetic global emergencies. As if to underline that they were no longer in control of the timeline, at 2:48 UTC, a thin luminous filament, visible to high-powered optical telescopes, extended from the surface of 3I Atlas toward Track 941. Analysts compared it to a tether, but the structure wasn't physical in the conventional sense. Spectral analysis indicated a beam of structured plasma, stable and contained, bridging the two objects across several kilometers of vacuum. Civilian observers began to notice the glow in their telescopes. Live streams on the open web surpassed 100 million viewers. Hashtags exploded. No one had official answers, but everyone could see what was coming. Inside a windowless control room in Colorado, a single classified line was added to the global threat feed at 0302 UTC. Event 2 confirmed. System preparing energy transfer. Estimated convergence 0451 UTC plus or minus 3 minutes. This was no longer a mystery playing out light years away. It was happening inside the solar system, on a schedule written long before humanity noticed. At 3:19 UTC, the dual object system entered what analysts later called the control state. Every reading coming from 3i Atlas and Track 941 pointed to one conclusion. The two were no longer behaving like independent bodies, but as parts of a single synchronized machine. Their energy emissions, pulse trains, and orbital adjustments merged into one continuous pattern, stable to within microseconds. No terrestrial network had ever displayed that level of precision without external synchronization. The luminous filament bridging the two objects grew brighter, denser, and narrower, until it resembled a solid structure frozen in space. Spectral analysis showed that it wasn't just a plasma arc. It carried structured modulation within it. Think of it less like a beam of light and more like a fiber optic cable the size of a mountain. Data was moving through it. Power was moving through it. Control was moving through it. At 3:43 UTC, a sudden quietness fell over the signal spectrum. The rapid encryption layering that had kept intelligence agencies on edge all day slowed, then froze. No more harmonic escalation, no more frequency drift. Just a steady, low-frequency carrier wave beating at 0.618 Hz, the golden ratio baseline. This wasn't a random number. It was the same frequency that first synced with Earth's Schumann resonance earlier in the day. The network had locked in. Inside the NATO secure room, the tone shifted from frantic decoding to grim acceptance. They weren't chasing the signal anymore. The signal had stabilized. It didn't need to evolve because whatever process it was executing had entered its final stage. The handshake wasn't a conversation. It had been a protocol leading to this. At 4:02 UTC, astronomers observed something unprecedented. The local space between the two objects, a corridor of vacuum spanning just over 11 kilometers, began to register anomalous readings. Plasma sensors recorded microdensity fluctuations, gravimetric instruments logged faint but measurable distortions, and magnetometers around Earth picked up synchronized ripples radiating outward in perfect concentric waves. The effect wasn't strong enough to endanger the planet, but it was global. Every magnetometer on Earth twitched at the same second. That was the moment when multiple intelligence agencies quietly dropped the term impact from their briefings. It wasn't a collision they were seeing, it was a controlled event. Meanwhile, astrophysicists argued over possibilities. One camp insisted this was some form of exotic energy harvesting, using impact energy to stabilize a structure capable of manipulating local space-time. Another suspected an information transfer, a kind of interstellar data bridge. A third camp, smaller but louder, raised a more chilling possibility: activation of a network node. If 3 Atlas and Track 941 were not isolated phenomena but components of a distributed machine, then what humanity was witnessing wasn't the whole mechanism. It was one piece coming online. The beam wasn't communication, it was control architecture. By 0418 UTC, the filament reached maximum luminosity. Power output surged to levels no agency could reconcile with natural mechanics. Analysts calculated energy readings comparable to large fusion bursts sustained for minutes at a time, but with zero visible fuel source. The system was drawing power from somewhere else. 0433 UTC. The golden ratio pulse deepened, slowing slightly, like a metronome counting down to something final. Civilian telescopes could now see the luminous bridge without filters. Social media feeds filled with shaky footage of a steady line glowing against the blackness of space. No one could fully grasp what they were looking at, but everyone could feel the gravity of it. In the classified comlogs of that hour, one sentence appeared repeatedly across multiple nations' reports. This is not a reaction. It's execution 0448 UTC. The two objects began a synchronized roll, a precise mirrored rotation that aligned their poles toward an unseen coordinate in deep space. The signal, the beam, the rotation, all locked together as if following a script that had been written long before the human race ever learned to look up. No human power could interrupt it. No government could control it. The only thing left to do was watch the sequence complete. And when the clock struck 4:51 UTC, the sky did not explode. It hummed. A low-frequency resonance rolled across Earth's magnetosphere. Inaudible to the ear but recorded by instruments worldwide, the filament flashed once like a heartbeat. Then everything went still. This wasn't the end of the event. It was the beginning of something larger, something that stretched far beyond the two silent objects hanging in the dark. The system had just taken control of the next move,